Rights forward and left reversed. So, Silver Palace sleeping cars. The Central Pacific, when they were first opened, were interested in, shall we say, maximizing their income, and in self-sufficiency and in self-control. And so instead of forming a long-lasting contract with the Pullman company to provide sleeping cars, they signed a license with the Woodruff sleeping car company and licensed the use of the sleeping cars. So instead of just contracting with the other company, they actually licensed it so that they could own it and control it. Silver Palace sleeping cars were already in service in the East on a number of different lines. Central Transportation Company was the operator, operating much in the way that Pullman was operating at the time. But the Central Pacific, as I say, chose to license it rather than just contract for it. Initially, the Central Pacific also experimented with a through Pullman train, but within less than a year concluded that they weren't getting as much money out of that as they wanted, and that they would actually get more money if they pushed everybody onto their own Silver Palace cars and sent Pullman away. That lasted until the completion of the Southern Pacific, when they realized that they needed to greatly increase the number of cars that they had. And at that point, they concluded that it was to their benefit to actually form a joint venture with Pullman to cover all of their lines with Pullman car service. And so from that time on, there was a joint Central Pacific, Southern Pacific, and Pullman agreement that lasted, and ultimately in the early 20th century that evolved into the standard Pullman contract, which lasted through the 60s. Anyway, so we'll start with that, but I wanted to actually start briefly with private cars, because railroad cars with sleeping conveyances on there, the first thing that comes to mind is the early private cars that provided a lot of that service. Here's the Lincoln car. This is what we believe the interior of the Lincoln car, how it was arranged. You'll note that it did not have kitchen facilities. It had 2 waiting rooms and then a stateroom in the center. Lincoln, in person, never rode this car when he was alive. His body was carried back to Springfield in the car. And the car subsequently went to the Union Pacific and was used as a business car, later converted to a coach, and had a subsequent history that ended after a number of displays in a fire in a Minneapolis field, grass fire that consumed the shed it was in. The Union Pacific did preserve some of the furniture out of the car. Here are several things that they have in their museum that are from the car. A long couch and a chair, and they have several other artifacts from the car. It wasn't the first business car. It was far from the only business car. This is an 1850s Baltimore and Ohio business car, and a couple of different publications in the late 50s and early 60s drew the floor plan of this particular car. Interesting. While the rendition is somewhat different, you can see it's pretty much the same floor plan. Chicago Northwestern had a business car. We have a nice, lovely interior photo that was taken of the car, as well as exterior photos of the car. I don't have a floor plan for this one. The Central Pacific, of course, built their own car in the shops. This, in the fullness of time, comes to the Virginia and Truckee and gets rebuilt as Coach 17, and is today undergoing some very good preservation and conservation work at Carson City at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. This is, I will say, a speculative idea of what the interior arrangement looks like. We found research that suggests this. I would not say that the research is in any way conclusive, but there was strong evidence to suggest that this was at least somewhat the general arrangement that was inside the car at the time. It was a business car. A quick view of it passing through Reno in the June of 1870, a silver palace car and some coaches coupled to it. The Union Pacific had their own business cars. Again, we don't have a floor plan, but we do have several lovely interior photographs of the car, both set up for dinner and then set up for a meeting. The Union Pacific also had, in the lower right-hand view here, a sleeping car that was in their business car fleet, as well as then at the promontory ceremony, where these photos are from, they had a Pullman car that also were carrying some of their officials. So they actually arrived with a 4-car official train as opposed to the 2-car official train that Central Pacific arrived with. This one's a Pennsylvania Railroad Division superintendent's car from the early 1870s. Again, a nice floor plan. So in the early years, they were still trying to figure out what's the best floor plan, what's the best layout, the most effective layout for a business car to be. And so there was a fair amount of early experimentation. D.O. Mills purchased his own private car in 1875. He was in partners with A.A. Cohen. Cohen apparently owned the Central Pacific car and sold it to the Virginian Truckee in December of 1875. We're not entirely sure of how Cohen ended up controlling the car and when he acquired it. That is still the subject of future research. But in any case, Cohen was a partner with Mills in this car. There was a lovely published floor plan of the car, again showing the layout. Shortly after this, Cohen got sort of into a legal fracas with the Central Pacific, with lots of legal suits and accusations flying back and forth. Mills found it somewhat compromising to be a partner with Cohen in this car at the same time that he's trying to stay separate from the fracas that Cohen is in with the Central Pacific. I believe that 2 years later, Mills arranges for this car ultimately to be sold to the Central Pacific and becomes the second director's car of the California. Stanford had his own car built in the Central Pacific shops in 1882. And again, this is the floor plan of that car as it appeared in the 1890s. Probably little, if any, change from when it was built. But this again gives a general idea of their idea of an arrangement for a private car or business car. So that's a quick look at private cars. Pullman cars, of course, were the other competing sleeping car in addition to the Woodruff car. As I say, very early on, there were some Pullman cars that were in operation out here. The Boston Board of Trade had a special train that ran from Boston all the way to San Francisco, literally up the peninsula and down Market Street, one of the very few times that steam trains ran down Market Street in San Francisco. This is a photo of that train when it's preparing to leave from Oakland. So they arrived in San Francisco, but they did leave from Oakland. This shows some of the evolution. The earliest Pullman car in 1859 was a converted Alton coach that they modified. By 1865, they had built their own car. This car was used in the Lincoln funeral train. Pullman made it available to Mrs. Lincoln. By 1876, you're seeing some more modifications and expansions in the cars. So this is a representation of the first coach. This is actually a reproduction that was produced by Pullman for one of the fairs, one of the festivals, and they used it for promotional purposes. But it shows the exterior and the interior of that car. and the patent drawings that accompany that from 1864. The Pioneer was that first Pullman car that was built in 1865. This is it in much later years, but you can see the general lines of the car. A view of the interior, again, this is about in the 1890s, but also the 1865 patents that are a little more advanced than the 1864 earlier patents. This is in the, as I say, late 1869 and early 70s, there were several Pullman cars that came out here and were photographed. These particular photos by Watkins of the interior of one of the cars. Here's another car at Oakland. Some of the cars had the patented dual trucks, that basically 8-axle trucks of 2 4-axle sets that are then pivoted with a span bolster that Pullman tried very briefly before resorting back to 6-wheel trucks. Again, another one, the Woodstock, which has the 6-wheel trucks. This is also here in California in Oakland. And the Palmyra, which was quite a famous car, had quite a reputation. Pullman in the early years had cars built by a number of different companies under contract. One of the companies was Barney and Smith. This is a Barney and Smith car that was built for Pullman under contract. We'll return to Barney and Smith and their relations with Pullman in a little bit. Here's some interior engravings from the very early 1870s of the inside of the cars. The car on the right here with the pump organs in the center is the Palmyra. Some of the cars that they had were also called hotel cars, where they actually had a galley and were able to serve food in the cars. This is separate from dining cars, which Pullman also had a few on. Again, more on that shortly. The porter would make up the berths for the people each night, so the seats would be converted, the uppers would be pulled down, and then some of the humorous, the elegance of Pullman travel in the 1870s. Pullman was not at all the first sleeping car produced. Here are some illustrations of some other very early sleeping cars. The little humorous thing from Harper's in 1859 where 2 trainmen are talking next to a timid passenger and asking if the bridge up ahead is safe, and what allows is how he feels if the engineer cranks on the throttle that the locomotive and tender will get across, and so he's headed forward. Woodruff actually predated Pullman. Here we see an 1856 Woodruff patent and a drawing of a Woodruff car from 1856. You can see that they were actually stacking people in 3 high in the cars for sleeping. By the late 1860s, Woodruff had upgraded his designs, and this was the introduction of the Silver Palace cars, which was the Woodruff cars. As I say, a number of lines, especially associated with the Pennsylvania Railroad, were using these in the East. And this is the 1867 patent that goes with the Silver Palace cars for the berths and all. So upgrading his earlier 1856 patent. It became quite a to-do. You can see there is even a song and chorus that was written about the Silver Palace car. Again, this is all in the eastern lines. Articles written about it, a view of the interior of the Silver Palace car. I'll note in passing that the silver was what we would call German silver, which you would know as nickel silver. That was the silver in the Silver Palace cars. The Central Pacific, as I say, received their own cars. This is the arrival of the first Silver Palace car on June 4th, 1869. The Sacramento Union ran an article on the arrival of the first car. A bit later, we'll have another bit of an incident that happened upon the arrival of that car with a separate article from the Union. Again, cars continued to arrive. Here is the arrival of Silver Palace Car D. Initially, the Central Pacific lettered their sleeping cars instead of numbering them so that they could keep them probably distinguished from the coaches and all, which were numbered. There were some variations in design of the Silver Palace cars. Two companies were contracted to build the Silver Palace cars for the Central Pacific. Jackson and Sharp in Wilmington, Delaware, built the majority of them. Harlan and Hollingsworth, also in Wilmington, built a number of others. So the first two cars from Jackson and Sharp arrived. This is a photo of one of them a bit later. In fact, this is in Virginia City. And then the first Harlan and Hollingsworth cars arrived. And let's just say that the Central Pacific did not feel that the Jackson and Sharps compared favorably with the Harlan and Hollingsworth. And so they requested some modifications in the Jackson and Sharp, the subsequent Jackson and Sharp designs, which they accommodated. So there was, this would be what I call Type 1 Jackson and Sharp car, which was a little bit shorter than the others and perhaps a little bit plainer. These ultimately are the cars that the CP uses in the service to Carson City and to Virginia City. And in fact, in the initial introduction here, this article says that the Silver Palace car goes all the way to Virginia City. By 1877, the schedule says that the car stops in Carson City. So it would appear that initially they intended for the cars to go all the way up to Virginia City. Subsequently, they thought better of that and decided to terminate the sleeping cars in Carson, and you would simply ride the regular passenger train on up to Virginia City. This is a picture of the Harlan and Hollingsworth car, again, a builder's photo. These cars were delivered and were very well received by the Central Pacific. There's actually a fair amount of information about these Harlan and Hollingsworth cars, coincidentally, from several different sources. There's this nice set of photographs that were taken by Thomas Houseworth, who provided stereo photographs in San Francisco. And he photographed the exterior and interior of one of the Harlan and Hollingsworth cars. In a Harlan and Hollingsworth catalog from the 1870s, there's this nice drawing of one of the Silver Palace cars, complete with a floor plan. So we can actually see what the interior arrangement of the car looked like. You'll see that there's two compartments in the car that you could engage in addition to the open section sleeping. Two or one? Looks like one compartment in there. Again, an ad of Harlan and Hollingsworth from the early 1870s, again featured one of these cars, lettered P. There was a French publication about American railroads that featured these lovely drawings of, again, a cutaway view of one of the Harlan and Hollingsworth cars, and along with some interior views. The second type of Jackson and Sharp car was this one, lovely builder's photo of Jackson and Sharp. And this was a type called a rotunda car. And while this has square ends, the rotunda feature was something that Woodruff continued on afterwards. This is a rotunda car from slightly later. You'll note that the ends are rounded, and I think the key is that there's actually a little room at the end, sort of a reception room at each end, and that's the quote, rotunda. In the Central Pacific cars, in some fashion, it was perhaps included in the square body, or we're not entirely sure how that floor plan worked. But they were called rotunda cars by the Central Pacific car, this group of Type 2 Silver Palace cars. And then there's the Type 3, which is what most of the Jackson Sharp cars were. And again, here's a photo, E and H.T. Anthony, a photographic company out of New York. And they had a series of photos on the Transcontinental Railroad, including this nice exterior and interior views of Silver Palace cars. This particular view features one of the Type 3 Silver Palace cars along with the Central Pacific's private car or director's car. This is in the fall of 1869 out on the Union Pacific at Devil's Gate Bridge, just east of Ogden. This is a heart view of the interior of a Silver Palace car with Leland Stanford and some other officials sitting in the car. The Central Pacific also had purchased a group of coaches from Lawson in Springfield, Massachusetts. And they decided that they needed a couple more Silver Palace cars, so they took 2 of the Lawson coaches and converted them into Silver Palace sleeping cars in the shops. The only view that I've found of one so far is this view, which is actually the completion of the Southern Pacific. The view is on the Pecos River Bridge in January of 1883, when the Southern Pacific line through Texas was completed. And this car, here's the larger view. You can see the Silver Palace, the Wasson car on the left, and a Sunset Route, Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio car on the right at the driving of the gold spike with the last spike ceremony. Here are some tickets that you might get for lowers and for uppers on the cars, and here is a plot plan where they're laying out the reservations so they can keep track of what rooms are reserved and who is where. By 1875 and 76, the Central Pacific needed additional cars, additional sleeping cars. So they contracted with Barney and Smith to build a group of Silver Palace sleeping cars under the license that they had from Woodruff for the Silver Palace design. This is a picture of some of those early Barney and Smith cars. This is up at Cape Horn, the overlook. Here is an article about the new Silver Palace cars arriving and also upgrading of the old cars. One of the interesting things to know is that the upgraded car is now number 7, and the next car going into the shops is car Q. So the transition from letters to numbers for the Silver Palace sleeping cars apparently coincides with this 1875 upgrade of the older cars. At the same time they were receiving the new cars. And then within a year, they got a second group of Barney and Smith Silver Palace sleeping cars, seen here. One of the things, as I mentioned, is that Barney and Smith was also building Pullman cars under contract. And at some point, Pullman decided that they thought Barney and Smith was actually producing Pullman-style cars and calling them Silver Palace cars, and that they were actually violating Pullman's patents, and they filed suit against Barney and Smith on that. Ultimately, I think the way that it settled out was that a few years, 6 years later, Central Pacific and Southern Pacific signed a contract with Pullman to provide the sleeping car service, and that may have been involved in the resolution of the suit. Here's a comparison. One of the upgrades on the Silver Palace cars is they replaced the 4-wheel trucks that they originally had with 6-wheel trucks as part of that upgrade. So this is a picture up there just above Colfax. In the rest of this view, you'll see a Nevada County narrow gauge train winding its way underneath. But this is a Jackson Sharp Type 2 Silver Palace car, and then a Barney and Smith Silver Palace car coupled together in the passenger train. And this is a view in the Southern Pacific paint shops about 1877, and it's again a Barney and Smith Silver Palace car going through the shops, and in this case the paint crew. So here's a roster of the Southern Pacific's Silver Palace cars. The majority of this is taken from the 1878 Central Pacific roster. And you can see that the initial lettered cars get converted to numbers, and then the Barney and Smith cars pick up with numbers and go up through 41. After the Central Pacific and Southern Pacific signed a contract with Pullman in 1883, they took the Barney and Smith cars in and rebuilt them to Pullman standards and operated them. The earlier Silver Palace cars, the Jackson Sharp and the Harlan Hollingsworth cars, they were turned back to Central Pacific, and in 1887 they started a major program of rebuilding them into other types of cars. So here's an article on the plan for Central Pacific to go with Pullman. They were discussing whether to go with Pullman or Wagner, which was the competing sleeping car line. And then from the Central Pacific annual report, they say that they have signed a contract with Pullman for a joint association. So in that association, Central Pacific and Southern Pacific were part owners in the operation, and Pullman was part owner. So ownership was shared in that association. And these sorts of associations were fairly common for Pullman to sign in the 19th century. Union Pacific Association, Northern Pacific Association, this was a common pattern that Pullman followed at this time. In the early 20th century, they ultimately consolidated, and the railroad simply contracted with Pullman to provide the cars. And here's an article where the Barney and Smith cars are being refitted to Pullman standards. As I say, Central Pacific then rebuilt a number of the older Jackson Sharp and Harlan Hollingsworth cars into other types of cars. Here is a dining car that was rebuilt from one of those cars. This is from the 1887 annual report for Southern Pacific Company, and they're talking about rebuilding a number of those cars at that time. Some of them were rebuilt as coaches. One of those coaches, in the fullness of time, ended up down in Hollywood as a movie car, and then from there went out to Old Tucson, where it more or less remains today. This is a photo in 2001, looking a bit rough. Here's some interior photos from a bit earlier. You can see it still has some of the original clear-story etched glass windows. You can see some of the interior fittings at that time. It is, well, and that's the B&T Derrick car in the foreground. And there they sit. If you're really perceptive, you can pick them out on Google Earth in the back lot of Old Tucson. Actually, one of the giveaways is the boom from the Derrick that's lying off on the side. As I say, Central Pacific also purchased a number of coaches from Lawson in Springfield, and a part of that order also went to Gilbert and Bush in New York. This is a builder's photo of the Lawson coaches. This car, car 12, is actually the one that is in the Calistoga Depot, assuming the town of Calistoga hasn't just burned up. It was on the ground in Stockton and much modified and simplified, and they took it into the depot, and it's a wine shop in there, but you can see it there today, assuming the town survives. Here's a couple other views of the interior and of the end of the coaches and what they look like. Union Pacific purchased a number of commercial cars, but they also built some of their own. This is the exterior and interior of one of the Union Pacific built cars built in Omaha. So this gives you an idea of what coach car interiors look like in comparison to the Silver Palace and the Pullman cars. Coach travel was a little bit rougher than sleeping car travel. But here you can see some of the array of cars that are out here. I'll note that the cars closest to the river, I believe, are all California Pacific cars on their way to the Stockton and Copperopolis. The rear car is a monitor-roofed car with a rounded end. That, I believe, gets rebuilt as a combine down there. There's a later photo of it down on the Stockton and Copperopolis. And there's a couple of other cars, one of which may or may not be an Ohio Falls California Pacific car. Again, a general view of the Sacramento Depot train time, a little vignette from the early 1870s. And again, at Cape Horn, they converted an old San Francisco and Alameda coach into an observation car for the scenic wonders of looking down the American River Canyon and coming over Donner when you weren't trundling through snow sheds. But the trains would stop at Cape Horn and allow passengers to get off and look over the embankment. Again, an early painting of an early Central Pacific train. Interestingly enough, the first car in the picture is identifiably a Pullman, just by the window layout and configuration. Immigrant travel was a lot rougher travel. There were very plain immigrant cars that were built for the Central Pacific. Again, this is one from Jackson Sharp. Again, another view, this one in Corinne, of one of those cars with just the arched roof top. Often they were tied onto freight cars. Sometimes they were on passenger trains, but many times they were on freight trains. This would be a typical interior of an immigrant car, this one on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And coach seating, again, a view. And again, an interior view, very simple, very harsh, plain conditions. And they could often be switched off to the side because they had the lowest priority. In 1878, the Central Pacific, Benjamin Welch came up with an idea for an immigrant sleeping car. This sketch design was sent to C.P. Huntington in New York. It was in his papers. These cars were built by the Central Pacific. One of the first ones completed was then sent to the Union Pacific, shipped to Omaha, where the Union Pacific started building their own. Central Pacific converted a lot of their existing immigrant cars into these cars, complete with clear stories. So here's a picture in Mill City, Nevada, of some of the immigrant sleeping cars with some of the settlers. So throughout the 80s, this was the typical immigrant car. This is pictures of the Union Pacific version of that car that were published in the Car Builder's Encyclopedia, Car Builder's Dictionary. And this is the interior view of a Union Pacific car. Northern Pacific also copied the design. Here's a picture of, or an illustration of a Northern Pacific car of the same design. Santa Fe copied it. A number of other companies copied it. Central Pacific shared the design around. They did not try to take any possessory rights to it. They wanted to spread that information around. This is a little thing on fares. You can see the contrast between first class and immigrant fares for eastbound and westbound. We talked about dining facilities. The hotel cars had some dining abilities. Pullman also in 1869 briefly introduced some dining cars, several of which came out to California. This is in fact a picture, a couple of pictures in Sacramento of these cars. But for the most part, people ate at eating stations along the way. The train would stop, you would get off the train, such as this one at Humboldt House, and you would eat. They would have these handy dandy little advertisements in the tourist guides, such as this one. A couple of others, the Sacramento one, the Ogden Eating House. Their eating houses, this was the common way for railroads in general, sort of like the stage stop, or if you travel long distance by Greyhound bus, they would stop at some restaurant along the way. Varying places had varying reputations as to food quality. The Harvey houses get their start in part at providing these eating houses, and they develop a very strong, high-quality reputation. Some of the Central Pacific eating stations also had a pretty high reputation. But you would stop at the train, and you would leisurely stroll off to go in to get your food, and then the bell would ring, and you would saunter back and climb on board your train to continue your travels. Elegant travel by train indeed. I'll talk briefly about couplers. Initially, everything had link pin couplers, including the passenger cars. In fact, the Cellular Palace cars were delivered with link pin couplers. This is the first day that the first Silver Palace car arrived, and on that day there was an accident because coupling height was mismatched between the two cars, and the coupler on the Silver Palace car overrode the coupler on the coach, and a guy got caught in between and injured. So those were some of the hazards of link pin couplers. You had to step between the cars, and coupler heights were not fully standardized, and so there were problems. This is the very same day that the article about the first Silver Palace car arriving in Sacramento, same issue of the newspaper. Ezra Miller had a better idea on a safe coupling system. We know them as the Miller hook couplers. It was a combination of couplers, but also platforms to prevent overriding and breakage and reinforcing the platforms as well. These were fairly rapidly adopted by the Central Pacific and numerous other railroads, including the V&T, in the early 70s. This, of course, is V&T Coach 4 here in Carson City that has been restored with Miller couplers. Some other contemporary drawings of the Miller platform and the Miller coupler system. Ultimately, when the railroads convert to knuckle couplers, for instance, the Virginia and Truckee, they're able to reuse the draft gear of the Miller system and just replace the head with a knuckle coupler head on the existing draft gear. Again, some other views of Miller hook couplers. But here again, from 1870, note all these things. This is before Miller hooks. These are all link pin couplers on these passenger cars. The other thing is, this is before the introduction of air brakes, which come again in the early 1870s. So one of the things that the Central Pacific used is this Kramer spring brake. And the patent is the upper right patent here. This was a thing that you would tension up a spring, and in an emergency you could hit the release and the spring would tighten the brakes to slow the car. These are some of the other patents that get applied. Seat patent designs for the Bunton seats for the coaches, ventilators, the Hewitt journal boxes, which come in the late 70s. Again, some of the other bits and pieces of things that you find. the parcel racks from the photo of the interior of the Central Pacific car, patent paper for a very similar design, and then a sample that's in the California State Railroad Museum collection that matches up. Some of the other things, the coupler kingpin cover plates for the Wasson car, this particular one is from the 80s. Signs for the platforms. People weren't supposed to stand out there on the platforms because it was dangerous. And more than one person was known to have fallen off the platforms in certain jostling situations. Again, other little details. This would be a bolster, car bolster in plate for Wasson. And again, some of the ads for the Wasson cars. There's a Wasson coach that is much rebuilt and modernized in the 90s that is at Jamestown, the Railtown 1897. This is an 1869 Wasson-built Central Pacific car. We've done some research, a little bit of paint research on it. Here's examples of course, this car was in movie service, so needless to say, the paint layers are extremely thick. But you can see a lot of the different colors that are found in there going through the layers under magnification. The trucks, the upper view is from the builder's photo of the Jackson and Sharp Silver Palace car. You can see the truck and fancier pedestal there. The lower view is the builder's photo of the Wasson car at Wasson in 1869, slightly plainer truck. These are drawings that were in that French publication from the 1870s that represent a typical truck, probably very much like those trucks. This is the truck, one of the two trucks on the car at Jamestown. The wood beam parts are original 1869 Wasson. The bolt holes for the original pedestals are visible on the back side. Sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, it was rebuilt and upgraded, probably increasing journal box sizes, and they used a new larger pedestal that they replaced on there. They actually had to shim the side of the truck out to accommodate the larger journal size. They also installed Hewitt journal boxes, which again are patented in 1878. So this is the car, but this truck in its core is 1869, has been under this car ever since it left Springfield, Massachusetts. And with that, I'll end. Questions? Yes.
I have a comment. I remember reading somewhere that the reason that San Francisco, Virginia City passengers had to leave their summer house cars in Carson City was because CP had misgivings about the Crown Point trestle. And it wasn't until some big rig with a very expensive car successfully made the round trip without any problems that they agreed to revisit that decision.
I've heard that. I'm not certain whether or not it's true. I know that the photo that I showed of the Type 1 car, that's 1875, before the fire. We know it's 1875 because it is before the fire. So they had run one up there at least. The big wig that I believe made the tour was about 1877, and I believe it was George Pullman himself in his private car that went up to Virginia City. But I'm not sure about that. All I know is that the original article in 1876 said that they were going all the way up, and then in 1877 they're just going to Carson. There could have been many different things that lead to that choice. The curves and everything, the weight of the train going up there. There are a number of things that might have influenced them to choose to terminate in Carson.
So really on the once the Transcon was open all the way across, is it a safe assumption that people that would have ridden in, say, August of '69 would be riding potentially in Silver Palace? Or what were they
If they're the first class passengers, the extra fare passengers, because what it was, the way that the ticketing went is you bought your basic ticket and then you paid a premium for the sleeping car on top of the basic ticket price. So I believe it's sometime around February of '70 when it might have been a bit earlier, when the Central Pacific finally pulls the plug on the Pullman cars. I've got one news article from the fall of '69, and they're alternating days. One day the Pullman train leaves, the next day the Silver Palace train leaves, and they're going back and forth at that time. So they're still experimenting with it that time. So, you know, the people who could afford it would be using a sleeping car of whichever brand in the fall.
What year did air brakes come into general operation use on the CP and the VMT?
72 for the CP and 74 for the VNT. That's straight air brakes, which was the typical passenger brake of the day. The VNT continued using the straight air brakes into '97 when they are compelled to switch to automatic air brakes. The Central Pacific converts to automatic in the '80s from straight air. Other questions? Very good, thank you.